This episode is sponsored by Netflix.
So when you were working on Brothers, I mean, did you always know that you were going to be telling the story, with that, in such kind of a subtle way? I mean, was that the plan from the outset?
It was from day one, actually. I mean, from day one, the idea of how to control the brothers and what happens at the end was there. Then, of course, I mean, during development, a lot of things happen and changes and stuff like that, of course. But it was definitely like, I mean, I had a very clear vision of the game, but it was just about, convincing everybody else that it's going to be a great game. And that took me a couple of years. It was really, because also my background is a filmmaker, so it was harder for me because I'm kind of well known in Sweden for making movies. People were kind of very skeptical against me because, the examples we have seen from, some example, like Spielberg or John Woo, but I don't think, I think they've been used as marketing only, they haven't been hands-on really, but I think that have created some kind of prejudice against filmmakers, coming into, making games. So that's what I felt. I felt like I was, working against, people liked the idea, but they were like, yeah, but what do you know about games and so on and so on.
I think that's true. I remember when they were bringing out a Hollywood screenwriter to do the sequel to GoldenEye over at EA, and that also was a bad idea in the final product.
Yeah, in the early days, I think there were some bad experiences with trying to bring those skill sets over and realizing that, and this is a generational thing, I think it's changing. You've got people like Josef now, but back in the day, filmmakers would get involved in games without having any real understanding of what a game was or what the unique challenges or opportunities were in telling a story in an interactive format, which is why we had all these bad experiences. And people like myself who come from a games background, I think have been able to be slightly more successful in telling stories in a game's context. But you just need to play games and understand games to write a story that speaks to the special. I think Brothers is the best example. That what I loved most about Brothers was not just that it was a great story, but it told that story in a way that was unique to the medium. It could only be told as a video game. There's no movie version of that story that I can see. It's so tied in closely to the interactivity, and so much of the way you experience the story is just meshed so cleanly with the game design that to me was like a unique experience, and it was a completely new way to experience a story.
I'm always curious about games like that because Brothers did have a really unique mechanic. Did you have that in mind already before you started writing the story in your head, or was it all sort of always revolving around that?
The thing is, like, I'm a big fan of the top-down RPGs, mostly from the Super Nintendo, like Chrono Trigger, Zelda, all those games, and those games were like kind of the inspiration behind why Brothers is a top-down. But then, like, with the control mechanic and how it ends, that's pretty much an urge of doing something different because I play pretty much every game out there, and I feel there's so many things to discover from a creative perspective. So it was like, I was sitting in my hotel room and just thinking about it, then everything came up, and with the controlling and how it ends, and from there, of course, a lot of changes happened. But it's funny just to talk about like my background, because when I get the question today, like, how has it been helpful to be a filmmaker, to make games? I think what's been helpful is that understanding that games are games and films are films. It's like they are totally different mediums. I mean, for me, I've made 6 feature movies, and making a game was like making 6 feature movies was a walk in the park compared to making a game, because making a game is so hard because of the interactivity. Because I mean, how to tell a story. I mean, you obviously know this too. Like, when you tell a story, you can control. Because it's a passive experience when you look at a movie. You have full control of the story, the pacing, what goes on. But here, you're in the hand of the player.
Yeah.
So you pretty much have like totally different, stuff to work with, and you have to like help the player, like pace the player. If the player could pretty much just stand still and the story would stop. If you pause the movie and you go like, oh, what's going on? It's very hard to tell a story.
Somebody told me once, and I think it's a really good analogy, that whenever a new medium emerges that you can tell a story in, for a while, it just copies what came before. So for the longest time, we saw stories told on a stage, and you would go to a theater and watch a stage play. And then when the first silent films came along, they really just copied that. They just basically put the camera in the audience, and it was like a flat plane. It was like just what you would see if you were in a stage theater watching a play. And then they began to realize, wait, we could have more than one camera. We could put the camera here or anywhere. We can cut between shots. And the language of cinema began to emerge and define itself as a unique thing. And then when video games come along, nearly 100 years later, what do? They copy movies, right? We had, remember the old CD-ROM interactive movies? But they didn't feel interactive. They didn't feel like games or movies. They were just they weren't satisfying either as games or movies.
Yeah.
And then after a while, we began to realize, wait, with cinema, the unique visual language is there.
Yes.
With games, the unique language is the interactivity. And we began to realize, there's a traditional way to do it, like with The Walking Dead, and I think even really maturing. I think Brothers is a big part of that.
You are the Al Jolson story.
That's what I just said. You are the jazz singer of video games.
That's very kind of you, actually. But it's a very interesting theory, actually. Because, from my perspective on how I look games, obviously I can't talk about my next game, but it's, again, something that I haven't seen before, and it's going to challenge, again, something to create a feeling for the player. It's so hard because I can't talk about
I think it's news that you're just making another game. That, to me, is exciting enough.
Polygon's going to run that article tomorrow.
Yeah, but it's not decided yet, but the interest is definitely there because Brothers has opened up a lot of doors, obviously, and the vision of the next idea is there, but it's, again, like very emotionally,
I was just thinking, because obviously we all know about what happens with the controls at the end of the game. It's just this absolutely just pristine, just emotional punch. But I forgot that also at the beginning, I think this is true and unique to games, when you see the troll and his wife is missing and he's just crying. I had made the assumption she had passed away, but it was just a moment I was like, oh my God. Like I felt really bad. And I don't know what, because a movie is kind of really telling you what to look at, because there's such the hand of the director and the editor there. But there, it's kind of that moment of discovery that yes, you've placed the character, the player's going to find it, but I take on a little bit more of the role of seeing it, discovering it, and then gleaning the meaning out of it.
It's much more subtle.
That gives it just a little bit more of a, oh, hold on, you're not telling me to be sad, I just became sad.
Well, the idea was, with Brothers was to keep the player as interactive as possible. Even like why the game has a made-up language is part of my belief is that if you have a language that you don't understand, you kind of, as a player, need to be a little bit more focused. And I think that makes you a little bit more interactive because you have to read the language of their body and stuff like that. And also by, because I remember that particular scene, the troll, people are like, well, people don't know why he's there, what's going on. I'm like, that's okay, let them discover it themselves. There are also many details in the games that are like that people really don't know, but I know what it is, but they don't know. But it's up to the player to kind of fill in all the details in the story. And again, like when you interact with NPCs with the brothers, every brother have his own, movement and animation. So it's pretty much up to the player to define how the brothers are. To put it, it's almost like you're telling your own story. That was the idea of it, at least.
I'm seeing that also as more of a trend in games where people eschew any tutorial and just want you to figure out things on your own, because I feel like the revelations that you have when you play the game that way are much more potent.
Yeah.
I think there's I think Brothers has a tutorial, but it's so cleverly ingrained into just you solving the first few puzzles. You don't feel like you play a Call of Duty game that says do this, jump there, now you have to do this. If you play Titanfall, there's that kind of 20-stage tutorial, which eventually gets quite boring. Brothers has to teach you a lot of things about the dual stick mechanics, but it does it all within the story. The first challenge where you have to help push the father along on the cart. Yeah. You're seeing the first chapter of the story, but you're also learning the unique way in which the game is played.
Yeah.
So
it doesn't feel like a tutorial.
It's really clever, and this is why I think the argument about whether or not gaming is as legitimate an art form as cinema or literature or whatever is kind of silly. I think any art form is all about presenting something to the audience, saying, well, what do you think? And inviting kind of a dialogue between the artist and the audience. And gaming can do that in a way that no other art form can, because you're asking the audience to take part and to make that piece of art unique to them. Like when we worked on The Walking Dead, we would sit in a writer's room similar to like a TV show writer's room. I always imagined that there was kind of an empty chair there that was occupied by like our fictional audience member, that we would hand over the story to the audience in kind of an unfinished state and say, you write the last piece of this, you make the choices that makes that story unique to you. And I think that's any successful piece of storytelling in interactivity. Walking Dead and Brothers did it in very different ways, but that's when a story really works. You make the story unique to them, and so it's so much more affecting. Like, we don't, no spoilers for people that haven't played it yet, but like that moment at the end of Brothers, it feels so unique to you. You're not, this is not happening to the characters, it's happening to you, because you've become that character by that point. I think that's why it was so emotionally profound.
Well, and it's also interesting they took up the tutorials, because when we were letting players try it out, and they didn't realize it. For some people it took like 5-10 minutes to realize what I'm not going to talk about. And they were saying maybe we should put a hint or something. I'm like, no. That's the idea of it, not telling anything.
No, you have to discover it for yourself.
Exactly. That's even if you go on for 20 minutes. I was
I was stuck there for a few minutes, but when I figured it out, it was still as revelatory to me.
That's the idea when you kind of like, oh, now I get it. Because if you would had some text or anything, you would have ruined the moment.
It's like having a symphony and suddenly let's remove the string section.
Exactly.
It's like, you may not, you know something is different, and then slowly you put that together. I'm curious, Gary, if, okay, so you've written for cinema, something that's a more traditional narrative form, one we're more familiar with.
Right.
You've worked on something that's kind of in that hybrid, like The Walking Dead.
Yeah.
Obviously, you played games. I mean, do you have to kind of ignore two other media when you work on something?
I think when you're working on something like The Walking Dead, which is kind of a hybrid, like Joseph said, it's good to have the basic kind of rules and good practices of storytelling. I think are pretty much universal, but you tweak them and they become unique to each medium. But like caring about characters and having an emotional engagement and character arcs and a story that we care about, that's unique to any medium. But how you express that and taking into account the player engagement. We were very strict on The Walking Dead about we wouldn't just let a cutscene run for like 5 minutes. We always ask the question, what is there for the player to do here? How does the player feel engaged in what's happening? Because otherwise, as soon as the player can look away or pick up, or is not being asked to pick up the controller, you may as well just be watching a TV show. So how do you keep the player engaged? And that for that reason, I think that interactive storytelling is the most difficult kind to do, because you still have to create all the rules of running a screenplay or an interesting book or a television show. You have to have the emotional engagement, you have to have a strong story, all that stuff is still true, but then add on top of that the challenge of how do you get the player, how do you make the audience member involved and make it branching and different, and how do you make them feel like their version of the story is unique to them. And what's difficult about that is we don't have all the language of that yet. Games like Brothers are helping define that language, but we're kind of discovering it as we go.
Thank you for your kind words. For me, I mean, the process of writing the story was so connected to the design of like the design, the puzzle, the everything. Because I think like right now when I'm thinking of my next game, the story is there, but it's the design decision that's going to be the hard one to actually make them like what, because that's the hard thing. Because I mean, we see many games today that have like a good example of that, a really good example is that Poppy and Yo, that downloadable title, where I think the vision was about, this guy who has his father, he was an alcoholic, he wanted to tell a really heavy story for him. But then I think you had a game design that went against the story. You had a kind of a puzzle design, and like a lot of using the same mechanic. So you kind of like tend to get like a bit tired of those designs. The design wasn't a part of the storytelling.
It feels obligatory rather than essential for telling the story.
I truly believe like making games, it would be a great thing for the designers and the writers to really cooperate together and not be a separate thing. I think that is very important to me, make better stories in games actually.
And I think that after we had a big success, because I wrote a little bit, but mostly consulted on The Walking Dead, and after that was a big success, a lot of other companies came along and said to me, oh, we want to have you consult on our game, because we want to figure, there's definitely a big, I think the two big things that are happening in gaming right now are VR and narrative. Those are the two big trends right now, which is great. One's a technical trend and the other one is more of an artistic trend, but I think we're seeing, as we get better at telling stories and realize that we're not just kind of throwing stuff against the wall to be dashed, that you can actually tell a good story, whether it be Walking Dead or The Last of Us or Brothers. It can actually work if you just put enough attention into it. People now want to try it and make it work. And if people say to me, like, what was the secret sauce in The Walking Dead? I would just say, just think about the story first before you think about anything else. I think if we want to become a storytelling medium, we have to prioritize story higher. I think games are still the only storytelling art form where you don't think about the story first. You think about the game mechanic first. When you write a screenplay or you write a book or a television show, the first thing you think about is what's the story. You don't think about the special effects or what are the set pieces. You think of who are the characters, what's the story. And I think games are still not quite beginning there with the story as the seed of everything else. I think you did, and I think that's why it worked. I think the game design and the story kind of grew together. Yeah. But oftentimes there's an idea for a cool game mechanic or a cool piece of technology or a way that you want to innovate as a game, but then they find a story to go with it, but they're not necessarily thinking about what is an interesting story to tell first. But I think that's going to change.
I hope it does.
Yes. I think also one important thing, because I agree with you 100% that the interactive medium, I think at the end of the day people want to get emotionally touched. And I think if you are, if you are like playing a story and you're interacting with it, then it's double the effect, I think. So I definitely, but I also think it's important to, because a lot of people has been talking about when will you cry in a game, when will you affect it, when you be emotionally touched. But I would say also that the uniqueness, like I'm actually emotionally touched when I play Mario Galaxy 2. From a perspective of a great level design, the colors, the level of like everything. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a story also. It could be like a really, really great game that like takes me somewhere else, then my emotions are there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, so emotions is not only about crying. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a story. That's also unique to the interactive media.
And that's why I thought Journey was so brilliant, right? Because there's almost, the story is almost nothing, right?
Exactly,
They leave it all to your imagination. Everything is for you. It just suggests for you to kind of create the story in your own mind. But I mean, and Brothers did this is why I like Brothers and Journey together. Journey perhaps even more so because they both work with very minimal palettes. Right?
Yes.
The characters in Brothers barely speak, but you still sense the emotions.
Yeah.
The characters in Journey barely speak. They have this little chirp, but you feel like you're bonding with these characters, and your mind fills the gaps. Like you want to experience these stories when you go to a movie, right? When a movie gets its hooks into you, like you're there. No, don't go down the cellar. The killer's down. Like you want to like reach into the screen and like grab that. We want to interact with the story, and cinema doesn't let us. But now that games can do it, the more we figure out how to do it well, the more you can not go down the cellar stairs to where the serial killer is, but choose to do something else and make that story unique to you. That's what I loved about playing Mass Effect when Mass Effect 3 came out. You have those water cooler moments. Everyone talks about Mad Men or The Walking Dead the next day after they've seen the latest episode, but you're all comparing notes on we all saw the same story. Whereas I'm having a conversation about Mass Effect 3 and went, oh, she's dead in your version? Like he's experienced a different story.
That was one of the best experiences, realizing just the extent to which the paths would diverge. Because I think this was actually one of the issues that caused, the outcry about the ending. Is that it was so elegantly put together. It was so like it doesn't go, hey, this is because of your decision. That I couldn't imagine how it could be different for anyone else because it was just so perfect.
Right. But and you can only do it, I think, when you're like playing at a level of a BioWare and you've got tens of millions of dollars to spend. But to create something that's that expansive, that branches to the degree that it does, the part of the reason why most games don't branch more than they do it, we can do it, we know how to do it, but it's just incredibly expensive, and the resources to create like 10, it's like creating 10 different movies, but you only ever experience one.
Exactly,
you still have to build the 9 other movies that everyone else might possibly see, and that's incredibly expensive and resource intensive. I think we'll eventually get there as we learn, how to use the technology better, but for right now, that's the reason why when we talk about branching storylines, they don't really branch very much because it's just a crazy effort to build something of that scope.
I think what this really comes down to is, especially talking to you, I think there has to be a level of insanity to actually make a video game.
Probably that,
That's probably what the crazy.
To be in this industry in general, I feel.
But I wonder almost even if the branching part of it is almost like a false, like people say, oh, people complain about The Walking Dead, the story didn't branch enough. But in the end, it didn't really matter because a lot of the choices we made would bring you back to the central spine. But as long as we can create an emotional reaction and do something that makes you feel like you care about that character, that's the emotional engagement, feeling invested in the characters is the journey, rather than feeling like you arrived at some ending that's unique to everyone else's.
Exactly.
Brothers only has one ending, right? But by the time you get to it, you really feel the suffering and everything those characters have been through.
I almost prefer that also because I don't like getting to the end of a game and then feeling like I missed out when somebody
like
tells me that they have a completely different experience.
I'm like you there.
That's a whole other discussion. It's pretty much about my anxiety.
I'll always go on YouTube and see all the alternate endings that I missed.
All right,
well,
guys.
thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
We talked a lot about movies today, and if you are a fan of those, then you got to check out Netflix. Netflix lets you stream TV episodes and movies directly to your home, saving you time, money, and hassle. It's also the only place to watch exclusive shows like House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. Best of all, you can support Rev3 Games and get a free trial membership by signing up at netflix.com/casual.